This is Bruce the Boss coming to you live from the great country of Texas, or state of Texas, but they definitely like to think of themselves as their own country. Texans first, Americans second. And a beautiful day out in nature, getting 40 miles in on a bike. And I wanted to discuss the beautiful display yesterday across most of Europe and Australia. It was Freedom Day or Freedom Fest 2021. People, millions of individuals turned out, whether it was in France, the UK, Finland, Dublin, Germany, Paris, all throughout Italy, Melbourne and Victoria and Sydney, Australia, to fight for their freedom against repressive government measures that segregate and or impose on freedom of thought, freedom of choice, freedom of their decision whether or not to get the jab. I will start off with a fast frame video from Paris to show you just how massive the turnout was, followed by additional live frame shots from across the UK, Victoria, Italy, and also more live shots from Paris, and then talk about the media blackout. Let's roll. So you saw the live shots there, starting out with the fast frame from Paris, along with whether it's UK, throughout Italy, more live shots from Paris, as well as Victoria, Australia. It shows that it was a massive turnout, hundreds of thousands in Paris alone. You saw the fast frame. It pretty much took out the entire portion of that city. It went for blocks. Streets were massively packed. It was like a never-ending sea. Also, over 100,000 turned out in London, tens of thousands in Victoria, tens of thousands, if not maybe 100,000, throughout the country of Italy. Again, reported as many as 2 million people, or anywhere from 1 to 2 million people showed up. But guess what happened? There was a media blackout. If you don't believe me, take a look here. And yet, go to the BBC, the largest media outlet in pretty much all of the world, but especially central and primary to most of Europe as well as Australia, and look at the blackout.
pretty much no mention of such of a massive protest and turnout across all of Europe. In fact, I have to keep scrolling down for even one mention of it, and that's here, where they do a short video on French police or Paris police attacking the otherwise more or less peaceful protesters. But look how it's framed. They're very careful not to say violent protests, but just say clashes, when again, it was in fact the police clashing with otherwise peaceful protesters there in Paris. And they only showed you but maybe what looked like to be maybe a couple of hundred of protesters as opposed to the hundreds of thousands in actual attendance. But again, look at all of this coverage and it's barely mentioned right down here. But again, keep scrolling down. Otherwise, no mention of the massive turnout across the world. Only a brief shout out to Paris. Not the UK, not Finland, not Dublin, not Melbourne and or Victoria, Australia, not Italy, not Germany, just Paris, as if that was the only place where there was ever any protest. And again, the assumption would be, based upon the framing of this article, is that it was just in Paris and it was a small turnout at best. Sky News, next to the BBC, they're probably the most consumed source of media throughout most of Europe, but especially primary in Australia and parts of the UK. Once again, media blackout at what was a turnout of millions across Europe, as well as several tens of thousands in Australia. Not a mention whatsoever. Keep going. 500 protesters missing in Cuba. So I definitely want to do a story on that. That's very interesting. But they're quick to talk about Cuba protest. I guess it's anti-Castro season right now. Keep scrolling. Nada, nada, nada. Let me try to focus on the UK because we saw turnout in the hundreds of thousands. Let me click on UK. Once again, they're quick to talk about a story of the loveliest little boy tribute as mother and son. Again, heartwarming, but not as massive of the turnout we had yesterday on Freedom Day, July 24th, 2021. Asylum seekers, more on the UK, minister apologizes, COVID cases fall. Nothing. Most read, millions. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Even if I switch the category to world, since this was a worldwide event, mostly concentrated in Europe and Australia, essentially. Pride event in Germany, I believe. If I'm not mistaken, it was Columbus Street Day. They'll mention that. They will mention Pride event. But millions of people turned out around the world for a singular event, and they barely get a mention here. And they barely talk about it says thousands. And watch them try to downplay it. Thousands of protesters march in Sydney, Victoria. This was a huge protest in Australia, and they are severely under discussing it, burying the story and or lead, and how big of a turnout it was. And then going to Sky News Australia YouTube page, I did find again that same story being discussed today. And when they did talk about it, they framed it as though, again, once again, undercounting how massive and big it was in Australia to begin with. Because like I said, by all accounts on Twitter and social media page from those who were there at the event, as well as some on the ground footage, it did look to be an estimate of tens of thousands, anywhere from 10 to 20,000 potentially, maybe a little bit more. I'm not going to play the video. I'll put a link in the description box below, but you'll clearly hear him try to underplay the numbers, just being maybe 3 or 4,000 individuals, and severely making it seem as though they are by far the minority by propping up numbers such as millions of individuals who got tested that day, about 40,000 or so who got vaccinated or jabbed that same weekend on Freedom Day. So trying to show why you have millions getting about a million, 1.2 million Australians testing themselves that day, and another 40,000 choosing to get the jab, whereas you have 4,000 who are just protesting. They are clearly the nut jobs, the by far a minority. Again, I believe he's underplaying the number of individuals there at that protest, just how massive it was, by at least 10, about at least 6,000, maybe much more, much more. And they're even framing this as well as blaming them for daring to speak up for their freedoms and a lot of the tyranny and draconian measures for these lockdowns without giving the people really a chance or a voice to display what it is they want from their what is supposed to be representative officials. They're trying to blame these people who are free thinkers and fighting for their freedom for extending the lockdowns, which I think is going to be really bad if they get even harsher in Melbourne and or Victoria, Australia, because they will really see more and more pushback. All right.
But why would there be a media blackout? I'll tell you why. It's the control perception. If you didn't think the media was biased before, it is blatantly obvious now. If it was a BLM protest, they were all over it last year. Even the BLM protest that occurred throughout most of Europe and Australia, despite the fact that there was no major incidences there. This was an issue primarily in the States as it pertained to George Floyd and or Rayshard Brooks. And yet the whole world had to take notice of it, get involved, and they even got permits from the government during the height in the beginning of the lockdowns last year. It shows the bias there. But here, literal blackout. As you saw, there was really only one mention in the BBC, and it was a brief mention, probably because Paris was by far the largest event. Like I said, hundreds of individuals that literally took up the entire city. There's no way you can ignore that. And even then, they massively downplayed it by just showing a couple dozen individuals who were being attacked by the Paris police. But otherwise severely downplayed the true turnout of the event. And then almost no mention of anything else in Italy, in the UK, Dublin, Finland, and or Australia. Sky News mostly buried it with one story that was hard to find towards the very bottom of their homepage. And even then, greatly underplayed the turnout and what it was truly for, as well as a video they did and or segment, once again, downplaying the event, just how large it was, how many people were upset, and purposefully trying to underplay the numbers as it compares to the general population to make these people seem like they were fringe and or nuts. And that's exactly what the purpose of the blackout was, to let others know, because millions of people are waking up all over the world, but they don't want you to know that. They want you to think that if you dare to question the one narrative that seems to be perpetrated across the world outside of Sweden as it pertains to what's been going on over the last year, if you dare to question the only scientists and doctors that they are allowing to have a space on the news, mainstream media, as well as social media, as it's been very well documented that dozens and dozens of scientists and practicing medical doctors have been silenced and had their voice taken away from social media. Keep in mind, a lot of these same doctors who are being censored on social media are saying these things as it pertains to certain medications that begin with I and sen, as well as others, and their treatment of their patients utilizing certain techniques and or going against the narrative. They are not having any of them, their licenses revoked. And yet it seems like social media has a much higher level of standard than the medical community itself, because they're taking those voices down and only allowing one singular narrative. And if you don't listen to that singular narrative, you are apparently, as Fauci would say, against the science, because that's the only voice that they're allowing you to hear on many of these on 94% of the social media sites. They're gonna make you think that you're an idiot, that you are alone, That's the whole idea, because God forbid you stand up for what you know to believe to be true, and you realize that the numbers are actually massive, people will start protesting in larger and larger and larger numbers. They're getting massive as it is, because I believe Europe is really pushing a little bit too hard and is forcing this massive reaction. Whereas here in the United States, they are pushing very hard. Check out the videos on massive censorship and or the surveillance state that has become the United States lately as it pertains to big tech, as well as potentially your text messages being spied upon, censored, and pretty much not allowed to have discourse amongst one another. And they're cracking down on other big tech sites, the remaining 5 or 6%. Thanks Amy Klobuchar for your bill that you introduced to try to sue some of the remaining social media sites like Parler, Rumble, and Odyssey for not complying with your one narrative. So a lot of dangerous moves, but not enough to trigger most Americans, the so-called land of the free, to truly protest in larger numbers what we're seeing happening as it pertains to our liberties and freedoms. And also, thank goodness for the autonomy of some of the states to be able to act on their own. So you've had numerous states like Florida, Missouri, and or the country of Texas be able to give back a lot of our freedoms. So we're living comfortably. Those in some of the other more, I guess you can say, tyrannical states like California, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they're fine because the majority of the population there, unfortunately for those who aren't in agreement, but they do represent maybe a minority in New York City, in most of New Jersey, and or the more populated urban centers of Pennsylvania, and of course California or California. They do represent the majority there, do like that dictatorship. They like being told what to do and following along. So they're just fine with it, those in the majority. But luckily, those in a lot of these states where we are not cool with that haven't been pushed to the point to necessarily have massive protests like that. But I am getting massively inspired by what I'm seeing across Europe. And it's very disheartening to see the mainstream media literally black out what's actually happening in the movement, which is why I find channels like this to be very important to get the word out, as well as utilizing social media to get the truth out in an era of massive suppression and censorship, which is why I'm doing this video, to not only show my support, but also expose mainstream media bias. So please don't forget to like this video, share this video, subscribe to my channel, again, in order to help get the truth out there and be heard. This is Bruce the Boss, and I'm out. Peace.